Thank you, everyone, and it's an honor to be here today. Distinguished guests, ladies and gentlemen, those in person and online. When we think about the transition to net zero or going carbon neutral and the role of finance towards a sustainable future, we tend to think green. We think of green finance, green bonds, green loans, maybe a green revolution. If we think about it, we might think of saving forests in Indonesia. When we think about going carbon neutral, we might think about planting trees and carbon offsets. But I want you to think more broadly about other impacts. So let's take a bit of time to think blue. I grew up in Australia, near the beach. The oceans are very meaningful to me. And I know that we have this in common. The oceans are also very important to the people of Japan. So let's speak a little bit more about the oceans. This is one of the most recognized pieces of Japanese art in the world. It is, as I'm sure you know, the Great Wave off Kanagawa. This woodblock print was created in 1831. It speaks to the strong connection that the people of Japan have with the oceans. Oceans cover 71% of the Earth's surface. They contain an estimated 50 to 80% of all life on Earth. They regulate the Earth's temperature, and they're the world's largest carbon sink. Any small change in ocean temperature can have a significant impact on life below water. A study published in Science looked at the impact of warming ocean temperatures on commercial fish stocks. When ocean temperatures rise, the fish react and they'll usually move on. High temperatures can also cause their food source to move on. They can't breed. Fish can't reproduce in these warmer waters. The study found that the fisheries, in particular in the Sea of Japan and the North Sea, were most impacted by rising ocean temperatures, with a drop in population size by as much as 35%. Can you imagine going into one of the Tokyo fish markets and seeing 35% less fish in there? Imagine what that looks like. Fisheries provide a living income and source of food for billions of people globally, with over 3 billion people using fish as their primary source of protein, the greatest percentage of any source of protein that people rely on. Japan's the fourth largest seafood importer in the world, and fish is a staple for most Japanese people's diets. Imagine if your favorite seafood dish was no longer available. Now we can think that because we recently had a problem here with clams. This is not in the distant future. This is one of the real-world impacts of climate change. So why am I talking to you about ocean temperatures and fish at a conference about sustainable finance? Because going carbon neutral is not just about the numbers, and it's not just about new financial products to help for ESG impact investing. It's about a genuine decarbonisation of the real economy that will help global warming stop. With each degree of warming, significant changes are predicted to occur in our environment, from droughts to floods to sea level rise. We're all in this together. If one country does well, actually your neighbour has to do well for us all to benefit. Climate change is a challenge of the commons. We can only overcome it with collaborative solutions, which is why I'm so happy to be here today to collaborate with all of you. In May 2020, as the world was grappling with the COVID pandemic, a Canadian cartoonist came out with this image. And it shows a town about to be swept away, perhaps, by the first wave of COVID-19. We didn't know anything about how to deal with this pandemic, but as you know, we all learned. But what the people in that town couldn't see is what was coming behind, perhaps the economic impacts, but then the even greater wave, which is climate change. So most of us to be here today will have had a vaccination. We used a lot of investment, we used technology and innovation, and we came up with a solution for COVID-19. It is still existent, but we are mostly living with it. But there is no vaccination for climate change. If we want to make a shift to a sustainable economy and a sustainable society, it's going to require a fundamental shift in the way that we consume and produce energy. Governments and private sector firms from around the world have committed to achieving net zero greenhouse gas emissions, with the goal of limiting global warming to 1.5 degrees Celsius. Finance is a key enabler of that change in the transition to a sustainable future. Significant financing and investment are needed to support these shifts, and we also need to be able to accelerate the shifts. The transition to net zero will require an unprecedented amount of financing, with global investment in energy infrastructure alone requiring an estimated additional $3 trillion annually in the next decade. So if we look to this region, Asia is key to the world's transition to net zero, with the region accounting for about half of global carbon emissions and more than half of global energy consumption. We need to find a way to finance the revolution that is fast and effective and keeps global warming in check and brings all parts of society with us. To move the needle on global emissions, Asia must move. The battle for climate change will be won and lost in Asia. As a low-lying region, ASEAN is highly vulnerable to the effects of climate change, especially with high concentrations of populations and economic activity along our coastlines. While net zero is a common goal, Asia needs its own pathway that's inclusive and still promotes social and economic development. Asia's transition to net zero economies cannot be made in one giant leap. Asia today still relies heavily on fossil fuels, with coal accounting for about half of total energy supplies. This demand is expected to double by 2030, as compared with World Bank estimates that there'll be 100% electrification in the European Union. There's around 45 million people in Southeast Asia who are still without access to electricity. Asia must find a way to transit towards greater sustainability while securing economic and social development for its people. It means that even as we focus our efforts on energy-efficient technologies and renewable energy solutions, we may have to shift the energy mix progressively, first to relatively less emission-intensive fuels, and then to other renewables. It means working out proper transition plans that are inclusive and effective. Now, luckily, we just heard from Mark and Hiro talking about some of these issues. Financial institutions have a unique influence over other actors as they provide capital and services to companies with responsibility for reducing greenhouse gas emissions. GFANZ, as we just heard, was announced at COP26 to demonstrate a commitment to align activities to net zero, influencing over $130 trillion worth of private capital committed by over 450 firms in 45 countries. It was a really significant commitment. The OECD has recently published a stocktake of emerging approaches and financial instruments on transition finance and is in the midst of developing further guidance that will facilitate the investment for the whole economy transition while factoring in different economic states of different nationalities. Taxonomies can also be a useful tool for guiding finance, as they provide clarity to the market on what activities could be considered green or sustainable. To take it to a local context for myself, from the Monetary Authority of Singapore, a key starting point in Singapore is for financial institutions to develop credible transition pathways for the industry to develop a taxonomy that supports transition activities while achieving compatibility with credible international taxonomies. The Green Finance Industry Task Force, or GFIT, convened by the Monetary Authority of Singapore, MAS, is developing a taxonomy that encompasses green and transition activities. It adopts a traffic light system that helps the market participants identify green, yellow, or in transition, or red activities, with the intent of reaching net zero as soon as possible. The GFIT has recently gone out for a public consultation on detailed thresholds and criteria for economic activities in the energy, transport, and real estate sectors. GFIT aims to release the criteria and thresholds for 5 other sectors, including agriculture, carbon capture and sequestration, for public consultation by the end of this year, and for a full taxonomy in 2023. I think too often we look at this transition to a low carbon future as a cost. And yet, if you look a different way, you could also see it as an opportunity. And sometimes we look at how to manage the risk, but that risk is to capital rather than the risk to people or the environment. So when we take a look at the opportunities, we can see that, again, particularly in this region, it will bring new jobs and new growth areas. This slide shows the size and the scale of some of those opportunities that we see here in Asia. The International Energy Agency analysis shows that about half of the reductions to get to net zero emissions by 2050 will need to come from technologies that are not yet ready for market and will require significant investment. Our financial regulatory agencies, such as MAS and the JFSA, work in close cooperation on bilateral and multilateral platforms, such as the NGFS, to exchange views and best practices on environment and climate risk. We need to continue to encourage those close collaborations, both from the regulatory side, but also with industry and with civil society. Japan plays a very important role in this region's energy transition, and we welcome Japan's support through initiatives such as the Asian Energy Transition Initiative and Japan's Energy Transition Mechanism partnership with the Asian Development Bank, which I believe Hiro just mentioned. To conclude, let's go back to the real economy. I can hear a few laughs here, so I'm sure many of you recognize this is Kiyoshi Kimura, who you may know as the tuna king of Japan. This fish that he's pictured here with is a northern bluefin tuna. Climate change and global warming are impacting biodiversity and the ability of this species to breed and grow. This particular fish sold for a record in 2013 of US $3 million, and that mark has since been exceeded in 2019. But we may not have a fish of this size in the future if we don't act on climate change now. To protect this fish and many other fish, the oceans and many other species, your culture and the culture of people around the world, we must work together to stop climate change and accelerate the financing of a just transition to a low carbon economy. Thank you from Singapore and the Monetary Authority of Singapore for the opportunity to speak to you today.